Okay, so welcome to Chapter 3, Biopsychology. It's a combination of genetics, biochemistry, and neuroscience. It's one of my favorite chapters in the textbook, aside from the learning chapter, just because, again, my educational background and my work experience. So to move right along into the content itself will make the most sense to you if you have had biology recently. I will be adding to the week 3 tab some additional video links to review some of the basic biology principles. So we're not going to get deep into the underlying biological science of this, but we are going to kind of skate where the biology and the psychology meet. So biopsychology for chapter 3. So you may remember from high school biology class, genetic variation. So there is an amount of our makeup, our individual makeup, that is controlled by DNA. So things like hair color, eye color, height, there's genetic links to certain disorders, those types of things. So the complement of genes that we start out with, we inherit from both parents. Now, there's all kinds of things, if you were to take an actual genetics class, that come into play. And this is worth mentioning in psychology. So just because you have a copy of a gene does not mean that that gene will be expressed. So that has all kinds of implications for genetic counseling and understanding. Just because a parent has a particular disorder does not necessarily mean that a child will. This also can explain why some things tend to skip generations because of dominant and recessive and codominant alleles. So really, genetics is very, very complex. So we're not in psychology going to do a deep dive off into genetics, except to say that understanding genetics and what is genetic variation, and then understanding the impact of the environment on an individual's development. That is a conversation that psychology is super interested in. So that the interplay between genetics and environment forms the basis of the nature versus nurture argument that is really just predominates the field of psychology. So that's where we're going to kind of limit ourselves to. We're not doing a deep dive in genetics, but we will be doing this week a nature versus nurture worksheet packet. So you do need to really kind of have a little bit of a grip on genetic variation, what kinds of things come from genetics. So we'll hopefully circle back to that a little bit later. Okay, so remembering from high school biology class, some of you guys that are looking at this chart right now might recognize that as a Punnett square. So in fact, the capital letter means that it's a dominant gene. The lowercase letter means that it's recessive. And so this would indicate a male parent. This symbol indicates a female parent. So when you combine genetics from two different parents, you have a diagram here using the Punnett square that kind of explains the different possible combinations. So again, this is very simplistic. Actual genetic combinations and codominance alleles and all kinds of things really, really make this quite a bit more complicated. But for the sake of our argument for psychology, we're going to stick with the basic dominant and recessive alleles. So you notice then that if you've got 25% of the offspring that are homozygous, homo meaning same, so homozygous dominant, 25% that are homozygous recessive, and then 50% that are heterozygous. So in a simple dominant recessive combination, then the phenotype is the expressed gene, so what the expression looks like. So in this case, 75% of these pairings contain a dominant allele, which means that dominant allele will be expressed. So the phenotype will be 75% for whatever this characteristic is in the dominant gene, despite the variation in the genotype. So the actual genotype, we have the homozygous dominant and the heterozygous dominant. So the phenotype here would be the only time where you actually have the recessive trait expressed. Anytime a recessive trait is paired with a dominant, the dominant is expressed. Now, again, we have to set aside codominant alleles and other things that debate is for genetics class. And honestly, again, this is a lot more complicated than this. We're just doing the simplistic version of this for general psychology. So anyway, so just because, so I put this in here to make a point, just because somebody has a particular trait expressed does not mean that their offspring have to have that trait. So for example, you can see that two heterozygous parents here, they both have the dominant allele expressed, but they can have an offspring express the recessive trait. Okay, so moving right along. So we mentioned the role of genetics in kind of using the Punnett square. So this is another conversation. So not only do we have the nature versus nurture conversation in general psychology and psychology as a field, but we have this gene by environment conversation. So maybe some things are genetic. Maybe there are some predispositions, but the environment that the person interacts with might activate certain genes or turn other genes off, at least as part of our current conversation here. So in this particular example, we've got Jennifer and Karen, who are identical twins. So here's the thing. Identical twins have the same genetics. Their gene copy is the same. That's where identical is coming from. We will also find out in this week that twin studies have been super important to psychology, again, because of the shared genetics. So if you're trying to study nature versus nurture or gene by environment, and you've got yourself a study full of identical twins, that's basically the best way to kind of tease out some of these relationships. As we talked about last week, it's really hard to get certain types of sample groups together. So in this particular case, how many sets of identical twins do you have access to over a long period of time to do your study? So anyway, I digress. So back to gene environment interaction. So Jennifer and Karen are identical twins, and they were born with a particular gene that absorbs fat twice as fast as the average person. So the question then becomes, is what happens to that gene based on diet? So Jennifer is the healthy one, super health conscious, likes to go biking, eats healthy food, cares what she puts in her body. And you notice that Jennifer stays her average build, that her obesity gene is not triggered. However, Karen loves McDonald's and fast food, eats fatty, unhealthy food because, comfort food is yummy. And Karen's obesity genes are triggered. So this is interesting because while there is a genetic link here that we're seeing, Jennifer has avoided triggering those genes. So this is something to keep in mind. Most of the people in this class may be too young to remember in the 90s when the genotype was identified, and there was a lot of interest in genetic testing for people to determine predisposition for certain diseases. And so one of the things that happened as we started doing genetic testing is that women were particularly interested in whether or not they carried the breast cancer gene. And it became kind of controversial because women that found that they had the breast cancer gene, a number of them actually wanted to do preemptive mastectomies so that they didn't get breast cancer. And there was a real debate within the medical community about whether or not that was responsible medical practice. Because again, as we see in this, just because you have the gene does not guarantee that it will be turned on and active. So again, bear that in mind as you complete your readings this week. Okay, so the nervous system. So this is super important to the psychology field just in general. It's really important to learning psychology, and we'll reference this quite a bit when we go back to learning. When I work with health science students and we talk about managing stress, I reference this all the time. This is a topic that you just need to know. So honestly, that's teacher speak for, you'll see this on an exam in mass later on. So the nervous system. So for those of you guys that have already had A and P, you will have probably covered this in quite a bit more detail than what we're going to cover for the purposes of general psychology. So for those of you that have had anatomy and physiology, this should be a refresher. For those of you that haven't, this will be an introduction in case you take A&P later on in your educational career. So you absolutely must know the organization of the nervous system. So this particular chart on this slide is something that you should, in fact, commit to memory. This is one of those things that is quite useful to have stored away in your mind vault. So the nervous system has two primary branches, two primary divisions. So I am a big proponent of learn the easy stuff first and then add more content in. So we'll start with the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is basically the body's control unit. So it only has two components, the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain is divided, this graphic talks about the three major parts. We'll go into a bit more definition as far as brain divisions later. But so the brain is the processing unit. So it's receiving signals from other part in the body, interpreting that information, and sending out messages to tell the body what to do with that information. So the spinal cord is just a column of nerves that run between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is key. Now the peripheral nervous system, if you know what the central nervous system does, and the peripheral nervous system is literally in charge of everything else. So there's quite a bit of territory that the peripheral nervous system encompasses, and the peripheral nervous system is super important when we talk about things like stress. So the peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic. So the autonomic nervous system regulates involuntary bodily processes. So there's a list right there on the chart, things like heart rate, respiration, which is breathing, digestion, your pupil size, and it operates without you having to tell your body to do it. So it's great because I can sit here and talk and lecture and not have to remind myself to breathe. I'm doing that anyway without conscious effort. My brain is not having to send the signal for that specifically. Well, again, talk more about brain structures later. So the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So this sympathetic nervous system is something that you need to remember as it relates to stress and stress management. So your sympathetic nervous system mobilizes your resources in response to threat. So if you are in the woods and you turn a corner and run on a bear or run up on a bear, your sympathetic nervous system is going to start dumping all kinds of chemicals into your body to prepare you to run from a bear, right? So if you are running from a bear, your muscles need more oxygen, your body needs more energy, and you are running from a bear, right? You are not, if you are running from a bear, trying to learn calculus. And I mentioned that, and in psychology, it's probably a very silly example, but the point that I am making here is if you are stressed, you are living in a situation where your sympathetic nervous system is active. Your sympathetic nervous system is a threat response system. So if you are stressed and not managing your stress well, you will find that you are a less efficient learner, okay? Hold on to that piece. We'll cycle back to it in 4 or 5 chapters. Well, probably 3 chapters. Anyway, so stress management is key, and I want to say that early in this class, early in your college career. Stress is bad. Okay, so then you're done running from the bear. How does your body know to return back to normal? So your parasympathetic nervous system replenishes your body's resources by turning back on your digestive system and slowing down your heart rate, slowing down your breathing, and bringing you back to homeostasis, bringing you back to your normal kind of average resting conditions. Now, for somebody that is chronically stressed and your body is constantly mobilizing for threats, this is why we see with chronic stress issues like heart disease and other things, because our body releases chemicals in response to the feedback that it gets through the nervous system. So again, stress is bad. Okay, so that's the autonomic nervous system. So all of that happens without your conscious awareness. You're not telling your body to do this. It is doing this automatically. So sometimes you might be stressed out, and objectively, you may not realize that you're stressed until you feel your heart start to race, or you've got a tension headache or something like that. So that is real. Sometimes your body notices and responds to threats before you really are consciously aware of what's happening. Okay, so the somatic nervous system, which is another division of the peripheral nervous system, carries the sensory information from the sensory organs to the central nervous system for processing. And then we'll relay the motor commands from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles. So the somatic nervous system is all voluntary movements. So the fact that I can walk and talk at the same time, that is courtesy of my somatic nervous system. The fact that I can walk and talk and breathe and construct my thoughts all at the same time is a courtesy of the partnerships throughout the nervous system. Okay, so again, know the organization of the nervous system. There will be at least one essay question on that in the essay pool. There will also be some multiple choice questions in the first exam. Okay, so some more biology here. So this is a picture of a neuron. It is a very simplistic picture of a neuron. So again, we're not going A and P depth here. We're just covering the basics for the conversation in general psychology. So what we've got here is we've got the nucleus. This whole piece here is the cell body, your axon with the information flowing this way, the axon terminal buttons. There's different textbooks kind of call this into different things. Whoops, sorry guys. So the signal will come in through the dendrites, and then it will proceed down the axon and exit the individual neuron through the axon terminus, and then I'll show you in a minute kind of how the neurons connect. So again, this is a really simplistic view. The myelin sheath is this yellow fatty substance. A Schwann cell is this middle part. Again, for the purposes of this class, we're just going pretty generic. The node of Ranvier is this gap between myelin. There's going to be a video in the supplemental materials for this course on your week 3 tab. I strongly suggest that you watch it. It has one of the better descriptions of signal transmission through a neuron and helps explain the chemistry of this. So I will include that in the links on your week 3 materials. I strongly encourage you to watch that. That should kind of help clarify some of the how the signal gets sent. Okay. So there are 3 different types of neurons, or 3 different categories, I guess I should say. There are many, many types. So you have your sensory or afferent neurons. So this is information that comes into your body through your senses. So your brain doesn't process information without it coming in through the senses. So we'll talk about sensation and perception here in a week or 2. So, your 5 senses, hopefully you can just sit here and name them just right offhand. So your neurons carry those signals to your brain for processing, for those that have to be processed through your brain. Some neurons, sometimes the signal only goes as far as basically your spinal column. And so for that, those signals we process by reflex. And so we'll talk about that very briefly too. Again, these are simplifications for what you may have studied in anatomy and physiology. So again, we're just giving you the general psychology level of need to know for this. So this picture graphic that I've included shows the direction of communication. So you notice in this that your sensory neuron picks up the signal, transmits it through. Then we've got the interneuron that serves as the connection between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So you notice in this chart that the signal's really only going one way through a neuron and then back down through a different neuron. So we'll talk about that. Again, the video does a very good job of covering that. Okay, so I also wanted to show you just kind of a graphic of how neurons look. So my very first neuron cartoon when I was pointing out the structures is, again, like I said, a pretty simple version. There are a variety of different neuron structure types. Again, I am showing that to you so that you're aware of that. I'm not going to test you on what they look like per se, but I just want to let you know that there is more going on with this conversation. Okay, so sending the signal. So I mentioned the information flow. So this is just another visual way to look at it. So your dendrites will collect the electrical signals. So here's the thing, this is an electrochemical process. So our bodies, to a certain extent, kind of operate a little bit like batteries. Again, there's some more conversation about that in the video. I very much encourage you to watch it. So the dendrites collect electrical signals. The cell body integrate incoming signals and generate outgoing signals to the axon, and the axon passes on that signal. Not every signal that the dendrites collect is transmitted through the axon down to the next neuron. So that's something else to remember as well. And that's got implications for things that we'll talk about later on in this course. So not every time that your body transmits electrical information, not every time is that signal sent on. And so we'll, again, talk about that in more detail as we proceed. So a couple of things. So what is the signal and how does it move? So again, this hyperlink here, I'm not going to play and record over. I will just link it directly in your materials. This would be a good time to pause the video and watch this video and watch the other one. So this list here under action potentials really is identifying for you the things that you need to know for the level of general psychology. So I've essentially included an anatomy and physiology video, and I'm directing you to the pieces of that video that you need to make sure that you understand. Although for a lot of students, they like the more detailed A&P explanation because it links up a little better and makes more sense because it's more complete. So that's why I've included this video. So moving on, this axon here, so this right here is actually the axon part. This is the terminus. So this would be a cartoon version of the dendrite on the next neuron. So this is a thing that when you guys do your worksheets for this week, about half the students mess this up. So I want to be very plain about how signals cross this junction. So you can find that information in the video. You should be able to find that information in your textbook, but I am going to cover it again right here because so many students have a problem with this. So this, the signal traveling down the neuron, it's an action potential. It is an electrical signal. What actually leaves the neuron is a chemical signal. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. The signal that travels down the neuron is an electrical signal. What crosses the junction between neurons is a chemical signal. I'd repeat it a third time, but I don't want to insult you guys. The reason that this is so important is when we are studying psychological disorders and treatments and pharmacological treatments for different things, a lot of those drugs work at this level, that they mimic the action of a neurotransmitter, or they keep a neurotransmitter out in the synaptic junction longer or shorter. So a lot of the pharmacological treatments that we have for psychological disorders work on this pathway, which is why it is so important that you understand how these signals go from one neuron to the next and how they cross the synaptic junction. Okay. So the electrical signal then triggers the release of certain neurotransmitters. So there's a video again where it'll show these transmitters, kind of the pockets, the vesicles, kind of attaching here and then releasing through. And then these are receptor sites on the next neuron for that particular neurotransmitter. And then so once the chemical crosses the synaptic junction and binds to the receptor, it triggers things to happen in this next neuron. The things that it triggers what's actually going is if you meet a certain threshold. So again, that video that hopefully you just watched, if you meet a certain electrical threshold, then the electrical signal is sent. Okay, if you don't meet that threshold, these neurotransmitters can do what they want, but they're not going to trigger the signal to move on through the next neuron. Okay, so another thing that you absolutely need to understand about the neurotransmitters is neurotransmitters are conserved. So once the neurotransmitter is released, binds here on the receptor, and then triggers the action here, these receptors will let go of the neurotransmitters essentially, and the neurotransmitters are collected back in here. That has, again, some implications for some medication stuff. Again, some of this you may not need to know until you're in nursing school. Some of this might be of interest just for you personally, but again, this explains how, or maybe not exactly how, but this explains some of how certain medications work. Okay, so again, clear as mud. I've given you video links. We've talked about kind of the psychology version of this. I have shown you a million cartoons, not just because this is an online class, but because in real life, if this were a face-to-face class, my drawing skills are terrible. All right. So this is another diagram that kind of walks you through it. So again, the action potential triggers some chemical reaction. The chemical reaction, so in response to the presence of the calcium, the vesicles fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release neurotransmitters. That means the vesicles that were here fuse over here, release the neurotransmitters through the membrane so that they can attach to receptor sites on the next neuron, and then hopefully trigger the signal to be sent all over again in the next neuron. So again, read this area of your book, watch the video. Hopefully it'll begin to make some sense as you stay in content and review that material. Okay, so quick check, because this is where students struggle. So when the action potential reaches the end of an axon terminal, it causes the release of. So hopefully you understand that that answer is D, neurotransmitters that excite or inhibit the next cell. So that's the other thing that we will mention but not cover in this class. Neurotransmitters can excite or inhibit. They are just chemical messengers. Okay, so receiving neurons have special what that fit the shape of certain molecules. So receptor sites. Again, that's a biochemistry thing, but you as gen psych students need to know how the next neuron receives that chemical signal. Okay, so again, if we were doing this in class, we would take a bit of a break and go over some things. So we're not obviously going to do an in-class activity here. This is an online class, but these three things, again, are things that you absolutely should know before you test over this material. Again, I'm going to take the links that appear in this PowerPoint and make a video list for you so that you guys can review stuff that way. Okay, again, you will be asked on the exam potentially. Again, the exam is a series of question banks that I've developed. So it's pooled, so not everybody's going to get the same questions. But one of the questions is about labeling neurons. Okay, so then spend a little bit of time. It's mentioned in some of the videos, so I expect you to know a little bit about what the myelin sheath does. Hopefully you can then answer that question right there. So moving forward, I want to talk about a reflex arc, and then I'll stop this video. Other things that you need to know this week, you need to go over the different types of testing and imaging. In psychology, I won't do a separate video on that because I feel like the materials in your textbook are pretty straightforward. So we'll talk about a reflex arc. So again, there should be information in your book on that. Okay, so I had paused this recording to get you a page number for where reflexes are covered in this textbook. And, you know, in a quick perusal of chapter 3, I didn't see it. I think it is worth mentioning, though, because it's good to kind of understand stuff. So if you've ever grabbed something that's too hot and then dropped it and then said, ouch, okay, this kind of explains that a little bit. So for certain things, your brain does, the signal does not necessarily go all the way to the brain for active interpretation, decision, consideration, and then decision making and resend the signal. Certain things are better handled more quickly. And so this is, again, an example of how your sensory neuron, your interneuron, and your motor neuron kind of link together. So I guess we won't really spend too much time talking about reflexes. Reflexes, though, again, you will actually cover those in quite a bit more depth in developmental psychology. So I guess we'll set that conversation aside and scale back to really what we need to know for general psychology. So we'll go ahead and talk neurotransmitters because it links in with this video and with this topic quite a bit. So something I want to point out in this video about neurotransmitters, for the purpose of our conversation for this PowerPoint, I've really narrowed it down to just a few neurotransmitters. There are a ton of neurotransmitters that impact and have roles in your body. So in your textbooks on page 85, there's a list of the major neurotransmitters. So what makes it major? Well, your textbook labeled it that way is one answer. And the other thing is these are the ones that we've studied more that have some key roles and things we will discuss later on in this course. But the table 3.1 on page 85 is by no means a comprehensive list. You will have a worksheet to do for this week about some of this stuff. There will be a neurotransmitter or two listed on that is not in your list in the book or covered in this PowerPoint. I'll expect you to look up a little bit of that on your own so that you can answer those questions. Should not take very long. The information's pretty easy to find. Okay. So this particular graphic, if I was presenting this in class, you would kind of see me roll my eyes a little bit about the particular title of this. Again, as we learned, if you watched the John Oliver video from last week about research, that science kind of tries sometimes to be a little too cute in how it markets its research. But there's 4 neurotransmitters that are worth mentioning and talking about specifically. So we're going to talk about dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins. Okay, so dopamine is super important. So one of the things that you will learn and get a sense of in this class, and also possibly through doing your research project, depending on which psychological disorder you picked, is that not enough neurotransmitter is a bad thing. Too much neurotransmitter is a bad thing. So our bodies need to be carefully regulated to be able to operate how they're supposed to. From what our research, we understand that dopamine is involved in controlled movement and the sensation of pleasure. So dopamine has been linked to the reward pathway in the brain. It's thought to play a role in addiction. So somebody with somebody with too much dopamine may have schizophrenia or exhibit schizophrenia type symptoms. Somebody with too little may have Parkinson's. So if you study Parkinson's for your project, which I don't believe it was specifically listed, but would absolutely be okay for you to do, what you'll find, they talk about the Parkinsonian movements. So the movements are kind of jittery or kind of stuttery. So when you do not have enough dopamine, then it impacts the fluidity of your movements, your ability to walk. I mean, I could just give you all kinds of videos about this stuff, but again, we're scaling it back to what you need to know for general psychology. So again, when we were talking about neurons, and I mentioned that medications will often act on the availability of neurotransmitters, either because they will be reabsorbed more quickly or more slowly. This is one of those examples that if you were taking a drug for schizophrenia, there's too much dopamine. then the drug for schizophrenia will act on the levels of dopamine to reduce it, either directly by cutting down the production, or another option is just reducing the time that it's out in the synaptic junction. So again, this is not a pharmacology class. We're not going to go into specifics of methods of action. I just want you to understand there's a variety in how some of these pharmacological treatments work. Okay, so moving on. Endorphins. So endorphins are involved in pain relief. And it turns out that they are very chemically similar to morphine. So endorphins are our body's natural pain responses. So they help to kind of, I don't want to say hide pain, but they can. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But when somebody has pain and chronic pain, and they need pain management, morphine, which was highly addictive, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about chemicals in the body in chapter 4. So, for pain management, if for whatever reason your body's level of endorphins and stuff aren't really working, you're in chronic pain, you may take pain management drugs. Depending on their actions, some of those are addictive and some of them are not. So morphine's super addictive, and we'll talk more about that in a future chapter. So opiates keep your body from making its own endorphins. So we'll talk about that too. So one of the recurring themes in science and psychology is homeostasis. Your body tries to maintain its balance. And so endorphins, again, help with pain management. They're involved in natural pain relief and pain suppression. Now, that doesn't mean that you should, count on your endorphins and then continue to do stupid punishing things to your body. Okay. But it does explain certain things. So we'll call her Paula. This is not me. I do not run. But a girl that I knew in college was a runner. I only run from bears, so I'm not a runner. But she would go jogging around. We lived in a somewhat metropolitan area, so she'd go jogging through the back roads and stuff, and run, 3 or 5 miles every day. Well, living in the dorms, our dorms were set up to where there, you had the 3 different hallways, and then you had the common area. So one day she got back from a run. The elevators were straight off the common area, so she just wandered in to see who was doing what. And we were sitting around talking, and we just looked at her and we said, "Paula, what's wrong with your ankle?" And she looks down and she goes, "Oh," she had no idea. Her ankle was swollen over her shoe. And she had no idea. She wasn't in pain. She didn't notice it. I mean, later on when I saw her, she had it iced and up. But the presence of endorphins allowed her to just be completely unaware of the pain. Now, that's not to say it doesn't catch up later. Again, we've talked about neurotransmitters don't hang out and in that gap forever. But again, endorphins can have, key roles in early pain suppression. Okay. So serotonin. So serotonin has been linked to mood, sleep, and appetite. So there are some evidence that say that if you have too little serotonin, that might be a factor in depression. So again, when you look at how medications for depression might act, they might act on serotonin levels. Now, again, a lot of psychological disorders are very complex, and you don't, if a clinician feels like part of the reason for the disorder is that there is a chemistry imbalance, a biochemical imbalance, then some of the drugs may directly treat what they feel is the cause of the disorder. Other pharmacological options may treat the symptoms. So that's something else to keep in mind here in a couple weeks as you begin the research for the disorder you select is, are there pharmacological options for the treatment of your disorder? Do those options directly treat the cause of the disorder, or do they merely just address the symptoms? So then the silly graphic, serotonin and dopamine, the only 2 things you enjoy. The reason for that silly graphic is that dopamine is believed to be involved in the reward pathway, and serotonin has again been linked to mood. Okay. Moving right along. So oxytocin. So oxytocin is believed to be involved in bonding and stress buffering. And you go, how in the world could somebody actually study this? So part of what you guys did for chapter 2 in research is that you designed your own study and tried to get you to put on your scientist hat to look at, okay, how can I research a particular topic? And as I'm sure some of you ran into, some of those topics are quite difficult. Okay, so scientists have created some kind of novel studies to study bonding and that kind of thing. One of the studies that I read about that I thought was pretty interesting in bonding and stress buffering is we know that there are particular neurotransmitters and hormones, and we'll discuss hormones as well, that are linked to stress and stress buffering. And so one of the ways that we can study this, one of the studies that I read, is they had pet owners bring their pets to the lab. And what they would do is they would take blood chemistry levels just immediately when their humans and their pets came in. They'd draw a blood sample, and then they'd have the owners interact with their pets for 20, 30 minutes, however long the study designed. And then they would repeat a blood sample and look at the various different hormone and neurotransmitter levels. Okay, so one of the things that I did in the dorms, so this is an anecdotal story, so this is not experimental evidence, this is just observation. So when I lived in the dorms at my major Midwestern university, I volunteered at the Humane Society, and well, indirectly, for their program that you would take like a small shelter dog or puppy out to the nursing home. And the idea was to promote wellness for clients that had to, were bound to the nursing home and maybe didn't get visitors, and, everybody loves a puppy. Well, one of the things that I would do is I would almost always wear a hoodie, and I would almost always select a small puppy, for the record, because people that were, bed bound or wheelchair bound could then interact with the dog because they could hold it in their lap or whatever. But also because I could put the tiny puppy in my hoodie pocket and then smuggle the puppy illegally back into the dorms. And so once a week, everybody would come to my dorm room and look at my fish. The fish was the puppy. So anyway, because we were allowed to have fish. So, I'm sure that I was super clever. I say that rolling my own eyes, and I'm sure that our RA knew exactly what was going on, but because the dog never made a mess in the dorm and it was never there for more than an hour, nobody really said anything to me. So it kind of became part of a routine that was looked forward to. Again, did I do an experiment? Did I have a control group and an experimental group and any of that? No. But I noticed that it helped my own personal stress level. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here. There will be a separate video for you to watch talking about the endocrine system. Again, please, please, please read the material and go through the information in your book and the supplemental videos. It's going to be really essential for your understanding for the course this week.